Hi everybody, Constabeta here, and today I'm going to bring you my thoughts on the current Round Dust 2 meta. It's been about a week in, and honestly, the way that I feel these characters feel and their power level is pretty different than what I've seen out there on the internet and the community right now. I think I've seen some people begin to change their opinions, and I just want to bring to anyone who's watching um, my updated view on the game, who you should reroll for if you're a new player, and my general thoughts on how these characters will scale going forward, and if the meta will change in a way that makes certain ones more valued than others. Okay, let's just dive right into it. So, just to provide some context, the way that I felt is the best way to play the game is to not let your characters die. Long drawn out fights are pretty hard to have. Generally, things are decided within 3 rounds, ideally 1 or 2 rounds. The reason why you don't want your characters to die is because it costs resources to revive them, and the resources will eat through really fast. So you do not want your characters to die. Only let them die on boss fights when it's necessary. And then, yeah, so the best way to reduce incoming damage is just to kill the enemy first. So there's a few ways to do that, and that's just going to really highly value DPS that can be dished out on the early turns. And this devalues things like SP generators or SP leeches, I like to call them, and you're more interested in buffing your SP efficient DPSs to really clear out the small mobs, and then you'll have a tank to maybe dodge the first few hits of the boss, and then clean up round 2, round 3. In my experience, that's how the game's been running. More or less in PvP as opposed to PvE, you're gonna have a lot of low SP damage dealers that are you're just trying to one shot as much of the enemy as possible. And if you're running a defense team, you're trying to survive through that and then use higher SP characters to clean up the enemy offense team. So some slight differences there, but overall, I think the power levels are pretty consistent through PvE and PvP. So yeah, uh, if you're a new player and you want to reroll, you might have seen Alec be ranked really, really high. He is no doubt pretty good for clearing out the early story chapters. 2%, 200% true damage comes in really handy, but you'll just find that if you make like 2 or 3 gotcha rolls, you're gonna +5 a lot of your 3 stars, and they're just gonna do the same amount of damage as Alex. So, um, honestly, solid B tier. I would not re-roll for him unless you like him. If you get more of his dupes and, of course, a good weapon on him, he could definitely be A tier, even S tier. But 5-star costumes are just really, really hard to come across in this game, other than the pub. So yeah, unless you want to hyper invest in him, he's gonna have other options that can just slot in just as well. So, speaking of getting dupes, Justia is a great character to get dupes for. Here's why she starts off in S tier, even though if she has similar values to Alec. She has 4 costumes available to her. This makes her extremely versatile, and if you invest in her, you can use any of those 4 costumes in situations where you need her to tank, or you need her to attack the front lines, or you need her to attack in a wide sweep. She just has so many different options to her, and that makes her really useful. And you're more than likely to get at least 1 or 2 of her costumes when you try to pull for a banner. So yeah, she's going to be built up relatively fine. You're going to get 2 copies of her in the story, but having just another dupe on top of that for either of her story costumes is going to be a great help at the start. So when you're doing your infinite reroll, getting 1 dupe of her and then her signature weapon is going to be a very, very solid start. Another character that's not talked much about for rerolling for is Cecilia. She has a costume that does 7 attacks and decreases the enemy attack. So she's a great support for kind of if you are going to tank some hits, maybe she'll push you past the point where your characters will survive. Unlikely, but possibly. And then her real value comes from attacking the enemy 7 times. That is a 7 attack chain attack stack that will really be able to push you past a threshold where you can defeat a boss in round 2 as opposed to round 3. So very, very good character to start off with as well. And you don't really need the duplicates to have that effect. Obviously, more duplicates means she's going to be able to deal more AoE damage, which is fantastic. So, yeah, solid pick overall. But is she S tier? You don't necessarily need her. You're not going to be slotting in her most of the time. A lot of this tier list that I'm making is going to be off of usage rate, right? You're going to have more than just one team built because the game is structured like a puzzle. And oftentimes you're going to need characters to reposition the enemy or really struggle around them. I always find that it's a lot easier to not have my characters die by repositioning the enemy and one-shotting them as opposed to running a tank and a healer and trying to live out the first couple rounds and build up SP so I can attack later. That has been my thoughts. Although, the other way is definitely more of an RPG approach, but I really think that because the game is structured like a puzzle, you got to approach it like a puzzle. Some other really good top tier options to have in your role that would be nice to have, aside from Justia and her weapon, or Cecilia and Justia's weapon. And always run for Justia's weapon, or if you're re-rolling for your favorite 5-star, get their weapon. Andrew is going to be a very, very solid character to have as a 4-star. Especially make sure you get his costume that taunts. That's going to have a lot more value than the one that life steals, although it's good to have both on him. But the taunt makes him a complete beast in PvP. And then also the taunt comes in really useful in PvE content when you need to survive a couple hints to get to round 2. And taunts are extremely valuable in this game because you're positioning your DPS characters to deal damage in certain ways. Your tank isn't going to be able to cover all your DPS characters or your support characters, so they're often getting one shot if you don't have a taunt. Arenas is a great 3-star. You've probably heard a lot about her. At +5, she gives a 70% attack buff and a 30% crit rate. Absolutely insane. Pretty much going to be on every team that you run. Speaking of buffers, Samay is going to be another great buffer. Significantly less attack at costume 0. So I think she gives only about 25%. But at +5 costume on her schoolgirl uniform, she gives a +50% attack and magic attack. So she's great on magic teams to buff them. And in addition, her other costume that does magic damage and magic resist down is a great debuff and does massive damage. So that scales really well with her costume on top of that. So yeah, a great damage dealing support that also heals. Samay is insane. But you're probably not going to run her as often as Arenas, and I often run both, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, either or is really fantastic. Another really good one is Cry. So Cry has 2 costumes available to him. A lot of people talk about his physical defense shred, which is very good. It pairs really nicely with Justia and Arenas buff, but I find that I'm using that a lot less than actually his other costume, his school costume, where he pushes back 2 characters for repositioning purposes. That also is really, really strong. But yeah, when you need physical defense shred, he comes in absolutely clutch. So another probably must have 4-star. And then, of course, this tier list would not be complete without an S tier God Wiggle. Wiggle has two costumes, both are very useful, but the default costume that allows him to suicide is just absolutely busted. If you're not running Wiggle because you seem like it looks stupid, it seems stupid, it is stupid. It's stupid strong, is what it is, especially with an Arenas buff. I mean, if you're buffing him with Arenas and Samay, he just clears 3 mobs on round 1, and that's already most of the mobs you have to deal with in a lot of encounters. So yeah, absolutely cracked unit. And if you can't one-shot them on round 1, he has another costume that does DOT damage. The key to using him is just to make sure that he does not get hit by enemy units, and he will deal massive amounts of damage. So my top spot for DPS right now, an absolute menace. But again, it's a 3-star. The 3 stars here on your reroll priority should probably not be as high as 4 stars, just because you will eventually get all these 5 stars. They're very easy to get, and you'll at least get 1 copy of them from the pub when you recruit. So yeah, all of these I would say are near S tier. I'll go ahead and order things just in terms of how I perceive power level in terms of usage, right? I'm always pretty much running Wiggle in arenas. Sometimes Wiggle doesn't target correctly for a certain mission, so you'll have to slot him out. Cry I'm going to put in A+ tier because I actually don't use him too much. His reposition is nice and the defense shred is nice, but usually if Wiggle and Justia are one-shotting things already, there's no need for defense shred. You don't want to defense shred something that's already dead. So yeah, these 5 up here in S tier pretty much form a core team that I would personally recommend for a lot of content. I would slot out Andrew sometimes just for even more damage or utility. This is a flex position, but these other 4 are pretty core. So yeah, I would slot out these 2. I slot out the most. These 3 I keep in the most. So Anastasia, big damage. Crit buff is cool. I mean, if you get it to work, but B tier, same usage as Alex. Beatrice, almost same thing, just a 3-star version of Alec. So a lot of these single target though, I will probably put in C tier just because, not that they're bad, it's just pick your DPS, you know? As long as they one-shot the enemy and they have a big enough multiplier, use that DPS. Bernie, interesting. I think she silences the enemy and steals some SP. It's kind of neat mechanic, but again, with battles not being too drawn out, I don't really find that I'm needing an SP battery, but I think she's a good free to play SP battery option. So speaking of SP batteries, let's also just place Olsen here. I'm gonna give him an A tier as opposed to A+ tier, and the reason is I'm just not using him a lot. When I have battles that go to say round 5, he becomes increasingly useful to limit enemy damage and stuff when I can't one-shot stuff. And so he's a very good pickup by all means, and he scales extremely well with duplicates. So that would actually put him into S tier if you were able to get to +4, +5 costume on him. And I think he will actually be a key meta character in the future when 5 stars start to get built, when maybe more encounters that are drawn out start to be introduced and you need someone to generate SP, he's going to be a top tier pick. But for now, not really needed. And again, you can also do well with some more free to play friendly SP generators, such as this winged Lucretia right here. So yeah, Carlson, a lot of these we have some super strong 3 stars, and then the rest of the 3 stars I will generally put in C tier because you should use them at +5. You should use these C tier 3 stars if you don't have someone that fills that role. So if you don't have a good tank, definitely use your +5 3 stars. Just because they're in C tier doesn't make them bad. Um, so yeah, just putting some of the 3 stars and just going along. So Eclipse, an SP sealer as well, I like to call them. Um, Better for drawn out fights. The heal is kind of unnecessary. She has a decent AoE spread though. Backline AoE is always pretty nice, but yeah, probably B tier. High B tier, maybe B plus in terms of utility. And then we have Elenir, who she's very like similar to Gray, I feel, or where it's a okay spread, but you're not going to be removing buffs often. So probably B tier. I have a lot of these B plus tiers actually. They have some utility. So she's very similar to the witch that you get, the Lapis Witch. Although I would say the witch has better usage because she has 3 costume availables to her. So that's different patterns. Having more patterns is extremely useful, especially her academic witch costume, which targets a very big area to remove buffs. But yeah, if you're killing the enemies before they use their buffs, there's no point in removing buffs. Oh, Elise. She's definitely one of my top waifus in the game. I rolled for her. I don't regret it, but man, I have to put her in C tier. I mean, her scaling in terms of damage is low. A lot of people thought that she would be great in a magic team. To be honest, I don't find myself running a lot of magic teams because the magic users available to us right now don't have good scaling like the physical attackers. They're squishy and they just cost so much SP to use. So, without any good reason to run an SP generator like Olsen, and you already have 1 slot for a tank, so that's already 2 slots. You run Same for more magic shred and healing and buff. I mean, do you really need a magic shredder that deals physical damage? I don't know what they were thinking when they made her. Um, it's just so anti-synergistic. The backline cross pattern is nice for bursting some things early game, but yeah, she's permanently benched for me. Emma, another really great um, 3 star character. She is super unique in that she can actually push units to the left, and that scales really well. So I use her as a slot in a lot because believe me, there's a lot of enemies that you would just love to just be pushed all the way to the left so your abilities can land. And on top of that, she's a great boss killer for her 600% attack buff on herself. You pair this with Same Arenas, I mean, she's just going to be one-shotting things every turn. So if you do have a drawn-out battle, she's a great top pick as well. And low SP, again, these SP efficient units that can take out the enemy in a low amount of rounds, I value a lot. So Emma goes pretty high on my list. I think she's a very highly underrated unit. I even use her a lot more than Cry, actually. So, you know, keep that in mind. Definitely treat the games like a puzzle and use her to reposition things. And speaking of reposition, another super powerful uh, character to reposition things is Rowell. Rowell, I would even maybe put in S tier, but as a tank, right? She's an evasion tank, has much higher evasion than Andrew, even at a 1 costume dupe. Pretty SP efficient too. So and she pushes a unit all the way to the back. It has massive scaling, not only in terms of one-shotting mobs most of the time, but also the DOT HP percent scaling makes her really, really good. Plus, you get a free costume for the newbie pass. So, yeah, a super strong, underrated unit. I think a lot of tier lists put her at A tier, but I think her utility and value has gone up a lot since then. Speaking of repositioning and whatnot, another really great character is Beatrice. So Beatrice, I actually put in A tier. I use her a bit more than Olsen. She's also decent in PvP to knock out some really annoying backline characters that on defense teams that people like to hide. But in general, you can cheese a lot of content with her and Wiggle. If you can't push units into a nice formation for Wiggle to one shot, and you see a perfect cross position in the back line, you can use Beatrice to actually target that center in the back line, and then Wiggle's ability will target that. So great cheese option. And I actually really like to keep her under leveled. You can level her up and invest in her for PvP, but as you know, some of your cheese might be ruined if she one shots the enemy center, which you don't want. So yeah, I keep her under leveled and use her as a cheese option, and it works great. Kind of the last reposition option is Therese. Therese super underrated. I can't name the amount of times where I wished I could just push the entire front row back for my DPS to just blow up everything. And yeah, her damage scaling is not that great, but you don't really need dupes on her. I wouldn't fully recommend pulling for her from the pub after the story mission, but yeah, there's just a lot of situations. Just if you get her in gotcha, there's no reason to ignore her. She solves a lot of your problems. She just doesn't do a ton of damage. All right, yeah, just again continuing through this list. DOT characters, probably high B tier. They don't offer a ton of utility right now. So things like Rubia and Gray are they seem neat at first, but yeah, DOT takes time to deal damage, and because the DOT procs at the end of your turn, it's actually kind of nice. You can get some kills that way, so they're not completely useless. And again, as time goes on, perhaps their value will increase, and their scaling is pretty decent too. But as 5 stars, I just can't recommend running 5-star DOT. If you need a DOT 5-star, run this C tier mage actually. Beatrice though actually does belong in B tier because her AOE has just a higher spread. Um, so she has a little bit more use, but again, you're gonna want dupes on her for her potential to really shine. Helena is a very interesting one. I've seen some Western content creators really value her damage reduction. I'm gonna be honest, it's 20% damage reduction. If you can kill 3 enemies with Wiggle out of a 6 enemy spread, that's a 50% damage reduction as opposed to 20% damage reduction. And if you're running a taunt, character anyways, then like, what's the point? She's a B tier for me, B plus tier. Definitely could be useful in certain situations, especially if you're missing a tank. But just kill the enemy. Again, another burst, 3-star. A lot of 3 stars that burst. And now we have our actually want to talk about our healers. So I said Samay is extremely busted. Not only does she buff your entire team, she also heals them really well. If you get costume dupes on her, she can heal every turn for 1 SP. It's busted. These other ones have more, this guy is more magic damage based healer, and this one is a DOT based healer. Just kill the creatures that are dealing magic damage or DOT. No reason to run healers when you can just run some May. So yeah, and the 3-star healer is obviously gonna be the lowest value of all the 3 stars. We have our main character. I'm surprised I didn't actually cover him first. I love strong main characters, and unfortunately, there's just not a lot of great options for Latto. He's very similar to Justia in certain ways where he does some damage, and he has a weird mechanic where he consumes his own HP and can be tanky, but it takes so much, you know, um, SP to activate. And also just the HP consume is a little risky. So yeah, not really my favorite pick, to be honest. We have another SP generator. These SP generators, SP sealers, are going to be pretty much more or less same tier. And then we have another taunt tank here in Leclisse. So she's an interesting one. I really do feel like any character with a taunt has to be at the very least A tier, but I would run Andrew over her pretty much 100% of the time. She has more survivability than Andrew. There are certain situations where your Andrew is getting one shot and Leclisse would not, but Leclisse uses a ton of SP. You're gonna have no SP left over to run any of your DPS abilities. So Andrew gives you a little bit more flexibility and is easier to build. So yeah. Again, more 3-star. Rafina is also an interesting one. Definitely goes into maybe B plus tier. She's another kind of very niche character that can remove barriers. It can make certain encounters pretty trivial when they use barriers, but hey, just out DPS the barriers. Seer. I see a lot of players asking about Seer. Seer seems really, really good on paper. Um, but yeah, as a tank, with tanks, you have to position them in a way to absorb the most amount of attacks. Enemies are generally so spread out, and your DPS are going to have to be where they need to be. So it's just hard to cover your entire team with a single um, tank, especially when they don't have a taunt. Speaking of which, though, that leaves us with Sylvia, who is similar as a tank, but she actually dishes out a lot of damage, um, even with her no dupe costume. So 125% attack counter is already very, very good, especially with 50% damage reduction. She can survive 2 to 3 hits in my experience and take down 2 to 3 enemies with her. So she's a great cleanup, sacrificial cleanup option, especially in certain boss fights that have more mobs that you have to deal with. You can't quite take out with Wiggle. Um, so yeah, A tier, plus she just has a really great overworld ability that you're gonna want. I would definitely recruit her from the pub if you have any spare 5-star scrolls, as opposed to pretty much any other 5-star. So I would prioritize Rowell as a story character and then Sylvia. Um, and then yeah. So that's my tier list. I hope a lot of my explanations made sense. Let me know in the comments if you disagree with the way that I've been valuing these characters and approaching the game. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but for me, this is the most accurate representation of what I've seen and what I've been talking to other players and how we feel the power is right now. You'll notice a lot of the 5-stars, especially the utility ones, are very low. It's just because their damage scaling is not that great without any dupes. So it's just very hard to justify running them over 3-stars or 4-stars that will just deal so much more damage and provide other bonuses and utility buffs on top of that that aren't as niche. Um, some people see this as a downside. I see it as an upside because I love having free to play characters that are easy to build. This means that people with maxed out 5-stars are, in fact, not sweeping arena because many of these 5-stars cost too much SP to even be viable in arena. We're seeing a ton of 3-stars, and really people who know what they're doing with their 3-stars do really, really well. I think the only case that I've seen where you really need maxed out 5-stars is probably the Evil Tower, which is a whole monster in itself, and I think will currently define the meta in terms of PvE content. I haven't gotten super far with it yet, so I'll have to do that and then make an updated tier list after that. But for now, after clearing the story and seeing PvP arena, this is my tier list. So yeah, thank you for listening, everybody, and I'll be back more with some art content, gotcha content. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.